Hello, everyone. My name is Rainer Furmore, and welcome to Hate Culture, where we discuss ideas, art, philosophy, religion, anything that has an impact on your life and culture as well. We have Dr. Thomas McCuddy on the show today. Dr. Thomas, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It is an honor and a privilege. Dr. Thomas McCuddy is president of Families of Virtue, a ministry designed to strengthen families and their churches through cultivating virtue and making disciple makers. He is also Director of Professional Studies and Professor of Apologetics at Carolina College of Biblical Studies in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where he has served since 2010. Dr. McCuddy has ministered in churches since 1998 across Tennessee and North Carolina as a youth pastor, and currently as the family pastor at Cape Fear Baptist Church in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He also served as a missionary to reach the world and strengthen churches through Families of Virtue. He and his wife Stacy and 3 boys, whom they have classically homeschooled. Dr. McCuddy holds a Bachelor of Science in Mathematics from Middle Tennessee State University and a Master of Arts in Apologetics and a Doctor of Ministry in Apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Dr. McCuddy, it is definitely a privilege to have you on.
Well, I appreciate you inviting me. This is going to be fun.
It's going to be fun. So, to the audience, Dr. McCuddy is also one of the traveling professors who come to South Africa to teach at our Bible College at Apologetics SA. So I had the honor to meet him personally and also spend time with him a couple of weeks ago, and it's been really an amazing time. I'm guessing it's good to be back home, back in the States.
It was 1 week ago today. We flew out, so like I said, still slightly jet lagged, but it is good to be home. We were gone 6 weeks, so.
And as you guys can see, I'm in a scarf and in a jacket, and he's sitting there in the sunny summer in North Carolina.
Very much the southern part of the United States. We are in full summer, so it feels like you're walking through water. It's so humid outside. So
great. Wow, that's great. Dr. McCuddy, how did you get into apologetics and philosophy? I see that you started out studying mathematics. So how did you spring from that into apologetics?
The long story short is early in the late 90s, when I was graduating high school, I sort of rejected the call to ministry, and I decided to go mathematics because of job security. Who wants to do math? So I figured, I was good at it and go that route. So at Middle Tennessee, most of my friends were Muslims, atheists, and Hindus. And so at that time, Middle Tennessee, one of the largest colleges in Tennessee. So very secular. And it was during that time that I began to come up against things like relativism and, again, the various isms that are out there. And it was just relativism was what was hitting the most. And the church really didn't have answers. I went to a larger church in town, but no one could really help. So I ended up going to the bookstores, and trying to learn as much as I can. And my very first book was Relativism, Feet Firmly Planted Midair by Greg Koukl and Francis Beckwith. But my real apologetics book was J.P. Moreland, Scaling the Secular City. And at that point, I was literally just trying to find answers, just trying to, not from a sense of systematic study, but just trying to engage all of the criticisms. So when God called me into ministry and I responded this time in 2001, it was Norm Geisler's books where I realized he had a seminary in Charlotte. And in those days, in the early 2000s, none of the seminaries, none of the schools had apologetic degrees, except for 2. There was one in California, and there was SES in Charlotte. And so that was how I ended up going to SES, more or less, just recognizing that if I was going to minister in the 21st century, I was going to need apologetics. I was very much involved with the youth anyway. And that's where a lot of these questions, a lot of these issues were developing. So I went to SES more or less because I didn't have very many options. Literally, I called back in those days, like you call every single school. They had a class at most. So I went to SES to get intensive training, having only a sense that I needed it, but not really knowing like the depth and not really understanding the full picture. And I just maintain as part of God's providence that I ended up at SCS and studying the apologetics for my master's, but it was more in my doctorate. I went and concentrated more of my studies in the realm of philosophy. I went into seminary to do more like a traditional master's of divinity. So I did the languages, I did the Greek, the Hebrew, and I was getting the apologetics kind of pushed in there, which was good, and I loved it. But it was really after I got my degree, '08 is when I walked with my master's, and being in full-time ministry, these issues of philosophy just kept coming up, and just recognized I needed better training in this. And that was why 2013, when I went back for the doctorate of ministry, I honed it, everything focused in on the philosophy aspect. And that's where I really feel after that I had the complete picture that I would maintain, that's not separate from the church, that the church is supposed to seek wisdom, and Christ is the wisdom of God. True philosophy is going to get you there and really help you understand the true, the good, and the beautiful. So that's that's my 2-decade journey, really,
Wow.
to get there, and graduated in 2020. So with my doctorate.
Well, congratulations. So just for the audience, why would you say apologetics, and specifically why is philosophy so important? And thinking about more um, anecdotally or personally, what you've experienced in ministry, what emphasized to you that there's a need for you to study this?
Well, and a larger portion of my ministry was as a youth pastor. So dealing with teenagers, dealing with their questions, that was the need for apologetics, to give clear answers, to understand how to bring the data together. But as I grew in that, I realized, all of the evidence, all of the ways we look at things, it's built on a philosophical foundation. So the more I kept engaging, it was almost the deeper I had to keep going, because I realized there's more to it. There was more fundamental issues, more that was there. So when you learn to think philosophically, one of the things I would learn years later, philosophy is the gateway to intellectual virtue. And part of what we teach in our ministry, that we want to be morally and intellectually virtuous, and the two, as we teach and we show, like with our logo, they're intertwined. It's like a tree, two trunks of the tree intertwined. And so I understood that as I go into philosophy, I'm able not just to do something separate, that philosophy is the pursuit of truth. And as I come to know what is true, and as I come to know what reality is and how to think about it in the most abstract terms, I have a foundation on which I can rest all the evidence and all the things that are there. So instead of just reciting this data and these ideas, I can understand why it's true. I can understand, as my students will sometimes ask me when I'm in class and I was teaching on the attributes of God and going through his metaphysical attributes, and they said, why do you believe these things? And I tell them, I cannot not believe these things. That I would have to be intellectually dishonest, that it's not a matter of opinion, that once you start digging down into the depths of what reality is, I believe there is a philosophy that comes out that holds all these things together. And if we don't dig and we don't find the roots, we end up creating almost like a Frankenstein monster in our faith, where we have these ideas. And I remember doing that early on. I remember in early in college, early in seminary, I had these ideas and they were contradictory, and I didn't understand that until I went down almost into the roots and demonstrated and was able to see these are two different plants. They are not the same thing, and I thought they were. So I think that's why the church doesn't need to be filled with philosophers, but the church needs that philosophical foundation, and they've not even touched it. And I think we at least need to know, we need to know what it is. Almost like, I am not a handyman. I do not. I know what a screwdriver is, and I know what a hammer is, and I don't get the two confused. So I think I'm doing good when I have that. But I view, like, I know how to use them. I know how to use basic tools. And for me in my ministry, that's what philosophy. That's been in the ways that I've sought philosophy, is to provide that foundation, provide those basic tools that the church needs, because that's what the apologetics rests on. And that is the foundation of our faith, because we believe in a God who is real and who provides us ultimate reality.
Okay. And the church, would you say then the church needs some philosophers to train the rest of the church to have some of the basic tools?
I think the what I have seen since, again, starting in SES back in 2003, so I can say that I've been a part of the apologetic philosophy scene for 20 years, and so watching really the philosophers come out, and there's this disconnect, and so you have the philosophers in the ivory tower that go deep, and like the William Lane Craigs of the world, and as deep as he goes, we need people to do that, but those are the specialists. So again, do you consider the carpenter? We have carpenters who specialize in very particular tools. They do one thing and they do it well. We need them. But we don't need is every carpenter to be that. We need more of the general. Like that's where the handymen are the ones that really are the ones that you're going to call up for the everyday task. And that's why I think what I saw within those 20 years is most people wanted to be the specialists. Most people wanted to go and do the deep dive, which was absolutely a lot of fun. I remember doing that my first year in seminary. I sort of did that deep dive where this was, again, my math background did not prepare me for Hume, Kant, Hegel, and everything. I'm learning all these names, all these things, and I'm like, woohoo, new toys. But I quickly found myself disconnected from the church. And so we need the theologian philosophers. We need the handymen, the handy women of the faith who are able to take these basic tools and put them to use and help others, show others how to do that. If we had that in the church, that's would only serve to strengthen the church. And so I in no way disparage or say, oh, like William Lane Craig. No, I'm indebted massively to the things he has written and the things he's done. But it was more of in some ways, and I know Geisler was always, the scholar, like he's written over 100 books before he passed away. And I had the privilege of working for Norm Geisler for a while. And I can tell you, as high as he can go, whatever he did, most of what his stuff, when you read it, he was in many ways trying to bridge that gap and help the church. And that's why I think some guys, they would look down, and I've seen the comments online, they're just like, oh, that's baby apologetics. I'm like, that's where the majority of the people in the pews are. We need that. We need the people at the top, the pinnacle, but that's a very small space. We need the broad foundation.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people haven't even, in a sense, to continue the analogy, they've not even opened their toolbox. They have no idea what's in that toolbox. And the basic tools of philosophy, apologetics, we need to know what those are in the church if we're going to thrive and engage the world in the marketplace of ideas.
Okay. I have other questions, but while we're on that, I want to ask, why is it important for us to engage ideas and to engage the world in that sense? Why can't we just live and just let live?
Well, the main reason I would say is again, for many of their ideas, they're not wanting to live and let live. They're wanting to thrive and kill whatever is opposed. Many of these ideas, they're mutually exclusive. You cannot, as I've said before, and I've said this at apologetic conferences, you cannot have a truly pluralistic society. You have mutually exclusive ideas that cannot coexist. So as the church, rather than just asserting that this is what we happen to believe, that this is our flavor, this is our preference, this is how we were raised. Again, serving as a pastor in church, this is what I heard all the time. And I would ask people, like, why are you a believer? And they would say, that's how mom and daddy raised me. And I said, that's not good enough. We need to understand why these ideas are true. We need to have this foundation so that way we can understand why what we believe is true. And if we happen to believe something that's false, we have the intellectual humility in order to recognize those things are wrong and to change. because I think that's the other thing that's hurting the church in many ways. I mean, and no one looks at the Christian church and says, "Oh, what a unified, lovely group of people." Like we're fractured all over the place. And part of that fracturing is just because we're stubborn. We won't even examine our ideas, and we won't even um, give time of day to different ideas. And not that we just want to absorb anything, but we don't even have the capacity. What I think what philosophy brings, the capacity to evaluate your own ideas for their own veracity. And we would just much rather keep them than examine them. But I would tell people, just because I've examined my idea doesn't mean I'm going to abandon it. I can examine my idea, look at it, and I realize, no, this is true, but now I know why. Now this thing has deep roots and I am grounded in reality, rather than just, well, this is what I've always heard, and so that's what I'll just keep saying. And I think that this is part of what our ministry seeks to do, is to call people to think deeply about the faith, because what you believe is true is going to determine what you should do. Ethics is always grounded in metaphysics, and the Christian life is an ethical life. To be like Christ is to live an ethically good life. And if we don't know what things are, we can't know what to do about it. So it's, I would say, absolutely essential to the life of a disciple to have a basic understanding of these things.
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. Um, so, would you tell us a bit more about your work as a professor at Carolina College of Biblical Studies?
Sure. Yeah. I started 14 years ago this August, and I went in teaching, of all things, English grammar. So back in the day,
Wow.
I managed to, yeah, like there was one position open and I grabbed it, and so I do like languages. So I was really strong. This is before we were accredited. And I just kind of fell in love with the college. It's a very non-traditional college. Fayetteville, North Carolina, we're a military town. So a majority of our students are former military. There, many times I can be the youngest one in class, in my early 40s. And what we found is the college seeks to, in many ways, enrich the church. That people are coming in, they want to be better deacons, they want to be better elders. That many of our students, we've even sort of targeted this with accreditation, that many of our students aren't looking to get a job, they're just looking to grow in the faith. And so I love it. Like, this, to me, this is how we're really going to impact the church, particularly here locally in Fayetteville. And so with my apologetics background, I eventually was able to shift more into that area and developed eventually what became the apologetics minor, and all the way to the bachelor's in apologetics, which, to my knowledge, in the United States, there's only one or two schools in the U.S. where you can get the full entire bachelor's on campus and get a full bachelor's, robust bachelor's of apologetics. We're one of the few. Plenty of them, you can get it at the master's, but our training was designed that we're going to cover a wide base. Again, we're not trying to focus in and create like the scholars. We're dealing not just with logic and the attributes of God, but apologetic communication. How do we speak persuasively? We try to create a robust program that anyone who's coming through, that as these pastors, these elders, these deacons are coming through, they're getting that kind of foundation they need. And I think that CCBS is, in many ways, second to none in doing that. I know I'm biased. I get that. Everybody's going to say, well, you work there, you're biased. But I can actually show on paper where we've targeted other schools, like the big ones, like Liberty. We looked at, I am Southern Baptist, so I look at all the other Southern Baptist schools, and I can say that we've designed our program to do just this, provide that kind of training for the lay people, that when they come through and they come out, they have that wide understanding, from the depths of philosophy and truth to the practicality, how to utilize this in their everyday ministries and even in their lives.
Well, yeah, I think that is kind of what we aim for at Apologetics SA as well, in the sense that not specializing in apologetics, but having it integrated into undergrad level. But also, a lot of our students aren't necessarily there because they feel called to ministry, or feel they have to have a formal job at a church, but they are there for personal growth and there to become better witnesses of the gospel. And that is amazing. That is amazing. And then from what I've gathered, your heart and passion and what kind of at currently what's your biggest drive is the ministry of families of virtue. Would you tell us a bit more about, firstly, what is virtue, what is families of virtue, and what is your mission?
So virtue in the broadest terms is what makes a thing good. So we define virtue as those good qualities of soul that are directed towards the good, that are perfected by God. This comes out of the Thomistic tradition. This comes from, in many ways, Thomas Aquinas, uh, via Aristotle. That this long-standing tradition. What happened was with 2020, when I was finishing my doctorate, most apologists will read from the first part of Aquinas' Summa, whether or not they agree with him. What I've noticed is that's where people go. That's Aquinas' 5 ways, 5 different ways we know God exists and the nature and the attributes of God. So I'd never really read past that. So I said, well, what's in the second part? And I jump in and it's all about the concept of virtue and the characteristics, the qualities that make us truly human and that unite us with God. And as a pastor, for 20 years, I asked the question, how do we really make disciple makers? Why is it all of my teens, they know the truth? My background in apologetics, they know what's true, but they don't care. Why is it the case that when I teach my ethics class at the Bible college, people don't come out more ethical? That's actually, many books point that out. They're like, no one actually becomes more moral from learning about morality. And once I, in many ways, stumbled upon this concept of virtue, I realized the church had a long-standing tradition, 1800 years, where it was a significant portion. And in many ways, because of modern philosophy, because of the rejection of truth and the rejection that that we actually have a nature, this immaterial nature, this soul, the rejection of all that led to the rejection of virtue. Everything becomes just personal values and nothing really grounded in the metaphysics of who and what we are. And so Families of Virtue was started really because we began growing in virtue. And I said to myself, and I said to my family, I said, this is a game changer. We are literally finally growing in a way holistically that I've been looking for 20 years, and having read all the discipleship material, couldn't find this. And here it's been this whole time. And so Families of Virtue seeks to reclaim this. So we're not offering a gimmick. We're not like, and this is what I've seen with a lot of ministries. They're putting their spin. They're trying to like, oh, we see virtue this new way out here. And I'm like, there's not just church history going all the way back to Aristotle. And even in the days of Plato and Aristotle, the idea of the 4 cardinal virtues was old news to them. Like, they don't even really know who started it. Like, it's just something they recognized. And when I began looking at it, I realized all of Scripture makes sense now, because one of the things we did, for example, is every command in Scripture, Jesus says, go make disciples, teaching them to obey all that I've commanded you. Every command in the epistles connects to one of the 4 cardinal virtues. And I said, this is the missing link. This is, in terms of the philosophy, the what we are and how we're supposed to be. Here's this link. So our ministry, in this sense, when people ask, they said, is it that you're trying to make families that are virtuous, or is it like a family, like categories of virtue? And my answer is always yes. It's both of those. That there is this sense where we're teaching virtue not from a sense of gimmick, or we're teaching it because it's the essence of how to live the Christ-like life. How do the fruits of the Spirit take root? How do you have good soil in your heart? Matthew 13, that there's the hard soil, the rocky, the shallow, the thorny, and the good soil. How do we have good soil? So for me, in many ways, the virtues, which deal with theological, the intellectual, and the moral virtues, make a complete human being. This is what we are. And so it's in many ways, the unification behind philosophy, understanding truth, that the highest of the virtues is wisdom, Sophia wisdom, as it's used in the Greek. Well, that's what you're doing when you're doing philosophy. You're seeking that. Like it brings these things together, and when you know what's good, you're able to do the good. And as you do the good, as you love the good, you will seek what's true. There's this interplay, and I looked at it and I said, what could be more descriptive of the Christian life? And no one talks this way. And for me, it's been one of these things that I feel like we stumbled upon, we want to reclaim. We want to bring
Okay.
this out in its entirety. And really, in terms of churches, we're not trying to get them to buy into any kind of program. We're just trying to get them to recognize what is and then pursue that. And that's, and I do maintain our emphasis with the family is critical, because family in many ways is where you're going to learn your virtue. And if we're all honest, it's where we picked up most of our vices. That most people, when they suddenly realize they're doing the same bad things their parents did,
Yeah.
that's the nature of virtue and vice. We pick it up very easily.
Just for the audience, quickly, what are the four cardinal virtues?
Four cardinal virtues. They're called cardinal not because people in my country they think a little red bird. It comes from the Latin meaning a hinge. They are the hinge upon which the moral life will open and the doors upon which it swings. So prudence, practical wisdom. So in other words, prudence is knowing how to do the right thing at the right time, the right way. Justice, which is giving to others their due, giving what is owed, like things like honesty and friendship, hospitality. Fortitude is courage. That's where you can. Fortitude is what moderates our, what we call our fancy word, the irascible appetites. Like when you have anger, despair, you have some difficulty rise up, and you have this reaction. Fortitude is able to moderate or even utilize those to achieve the good. And temperance is where it moderates your sensory pleasures. So that's why things like, how do you avoid gluttony? How do you avoid sexual morality? Temperance is the quality. All four of these are qualities of the soul. They're characteristics in here that manifest outwards. And that's why when we're lacking those things, if we're lacking practical wisdom, if we're lacking a sense of justice and giving to others, we have no courage, and we're just gluttons, then it's no wonder we can't live like Jesus. Like no one who's that way wants to, and in some sense, they're not even trained to. Virtue is in many ways the kind of training, the kinds of things I can do naturally by which the Holy Spirit then can produce a fruit. Because when you look at the fruits of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self-control, they all coordinate with the four cardinal virtues. And so I view those virtues almost as like, because we're made in the image of God, we're made to reflect him. He's given us a natural capacity to do things like use our minds to learn truth and practice goodness to practice good habits. All virtues are habits of the soul. And so when we do this, what we're doing is through our own efforts, and people will look at this like, how is this not works-based righteousness? I'm like, it's literally the kinds of righteousness. When Job was called a righteous man, it's a horizontal righteousness. We're functioning the way we're supposed to. We cannot attain a vertical righteousness. That comes only by grace through faith. Like we cannot obtain the righteousness of Christ except by faith. But if horizontally, if I just function as a good human being, as I've been given the ability to do by the image of God, then what's happening is I'm not running in an opposite direction. And the Holy Spirit's like, no, 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 come here, come here, come here. We want self-control. And I'm over here like, no, I'm not self-controlled. And what's the Spirit to do unless he like completely wrenches us? How much better, and what do we not read in Scripture? The call, the urging to change how we live. And then what we'll see is a supernatural result beyond whatever we could do. So that's your 60-second version of probably 32 weeks of training we do in our ministry.
Yeah, but it excites me. I think when I'm done with the worldview series, I think we should have a chat again, and then we can do a bit of a deep dive on what virtue is and why it is important, and how can we pursue it. And And I could definitely see how that is kind of supposed to be part of our sanctification process, I think, is to get to a place where we live virtuously and it's also part of loving your neighbor. Um, yeah, so yeah, that is amazing. So the main reason we're having this discussion, well, for me this evening, for you midday, but the reason we're having this discussion is I want to pick your brain on worldviews and specifically naturalism. But before we get into naturalism, how would you define worldview and why is it important to not only, we touched on it earlier, but not only evaluate your own, but other worldviews as well?
So I'm one of those strange creatures when I consider the idea of worldview. I think people fall into some different camps, and so you have the people that are more like the hardcore worldviews or these solid things, and they might even use them as the illustration of like putting on glasses, and you have this worldview that impacts you. And I view that as very Kantian. Kant was very much that way. He viewed the worldview. He's the first one to really use the word in a kind of that official context. He does it sort of in passing, but it really takes off after him. And he viewed it as, in some ways, like a mental straitjacket. Like you have your worldview and you're stuck, and that's why you only know the phenomena. You can never know the nomina. You can never know the thing in itself. Your worldview must necessarily interpret all of that data, and you're stuck. So I generally reject that because, again, coming from the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, I would say we don't have that problem. That most people they try to put, well, how do we get past our worldviews? And I'm like, well, if you don't start there, you don't have that problem. I view the worldviews much more as descriptively. That I talk about worldviews as describing more of a category, the way people kind of think, and we can think of the worldviews as these descriptions that can help us understand people, but they're not that mental straitjacket. Kind of like, okay, many people say this: we want the biblical worldview, so let's find it and let's put that on, and we're gonna put on the biblical worldview. And I'm like, I don't think that's how that works. I think the biblical worldview is more of that description. People who are taking the Bible seriously, who are looking at Scripture, how is it that they're going to see the world? What is this? What are some of the viewpoints that are going to come from Scripture? Kind of like the whole notion of the image of God. That even when I use this term, the fact that we're made in the image of God, that's coming from Scripture. So that's going to, in that sense, color what I'm seeing. And so as you would try to describe the way I view the world, that would be my worldview. But again, I don't view them as so hard and fast. And so that's why when we talk about them, and when I teach a class on worldviews at my Bible college, we even at our Bible college, we're called to train in the biblical worldview. And one of the fun things I always do is I ask people, well, what is that? Because we'll be sitting if I got my classroom of Christians, and I'm like, I just go through a couple of doctrinal areas, and we all differ because we're a non-denominational school. So I said, all right, so which one of you has the biblical worldview? Or do any of you? I was like, do none of you, or do all of you, in a sense? Like what is this thing? I don't think we've done, and this is why, going back to why we need philosophy, I don't think we've really spent the time on that issue. What is worldview and how it works from a truly Christian perspective? I think there's work to be done there. So I'm more raising questions that I'm not going to answer, honestly. These are the things we work out sometimes in my classes. But I think it's helpful in the sense, particularly it's useful with things like evangelism. If I understand the atheistic worldview in general, if I understand the Islamic worldview in general, even as I've been going into Africa, I've been reading on the African worldviews, plural. People are very quick to say there's no one African worldview. There's all these different ways that people view the world. But if I can get a sense of these lines of thinking, if I can get into the philosophy that undergirds this and the views of reality that sort of formulate and fashion these ideas, that's going to help me know how to engage other people generally. Because even in Nepal, when I was in Nepal, and I come to find out that many of the Buddhists in Nepal will worship Buddha as God, which, having studied Buddhism, that's one of the things they say is, like, oh, they don't worship Buddha as God. It's like, well, the Nepali Buddhists do, at least some of them, and from my students, some of them coming out of Hinduism and Buddhism, they're like, well, it's actually a lot of them. So I've learned the worldviews are good general tools. They have their place, but I don't ever want to be in or try to. I never want to communicate to my students, communicate to people to lock in like, oh, this is this particular worldview, and when you meet someone, here's exactly how this is going to go down. I think it's a far more general tool, but a very useful tool to catch that kaleidoscope, and particularly with what James Sire does with University Next Door, he shows this movement of ideas. He shows how the
Mm.
worldviews were shifting and sliding, and how they've tried to pull up in modern days based upon what they've some of the things they've jettisoned. I find that to be exceedingly helpful. It's very useful in that sense. But it goes back to learn how to use your tools the right way. When you try to use the screwdriver as a hammer, you're doing it wrong. So
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because also it's not as if, based on on my own experience, not as if one person is like purely an existentialist and everything this person does and says you can put into that category. Some of the things, some of the things, even Christians, there's a bit of New Age in there. There's a bit of this in there. Um, you just mentioned Immanuel Kant. A lot of South Africa, and I think when you were here in South Africa, we spoke about this, is influenced by Kant's ideas, and I think in the Western world is influenced by Kant's ideas. So these ideas have consequences, and I think we're kind of in a mixed bag, and we're trying to navigate this. But yeah, I've I think I've fallen victim to, or not victim to, but I was affected by that idea of Kant, to kind of think of this worldview straitjacket, and this is. But yeah, thank you for enlightening me on that. So on a previous episode, I spoke to Simon Forster, and he taught us about deism and how, sorry, going from theism to deism kind of started to create this like slippery slope that kind of inclined towards, or declined towards, atheism, more specifically naturalism. What is naturalism and what gave rise to it?
well, and you're right in terms of particularly the Western world. You see that slide that for the longest you have this theistic mindset. There's the God who is the creator and who's involved in the world, and then deism, he becomes not involved in the world, he's not doing the miracles, or he doesn't care. Again, there's various derivations of deism. But it was a quick hop, skip, and a jump into naturalism, because when you have a world and God is not involved at all, you pretty much just have a naturalistic world. Everything functions according to the laws of physics. And for the creator who is not there, like in the case of deism, it's quite easy just to simply say he was never there to begin with. And now you have to give an account, though. What is the nature of reality? How do things work? How did we get here? You're still having to answer all of the primary, I would say there's just the philosophical questions. Again, what are we? What are things? You go into what is the nature of being? Again, that's metaphysics. So how do we know things? That's epistemology. All these ideas get wrapped up together. And I think this is why, in some ways too, I teach when I do this, that theology and philosophy and worldview almost create like this Venn diagram. They're these ideas that are interplaying together, and that depending upon where you plant your feet, the other two bubbles are going to adapt. So this is why, for those who have said there is no God, now they have to adapt everything around that. And naturalism is going to be one of your best options for that. That if there is no God, and this is where we've moved to as atheism is on the rise, particularly within academia. I know it's in rise now among the culture. I think the Gen Z is the generation coming out of high school going into college right now. I mean, they are very much the largest atheistic group we have. But before then, it was all trying to make sense of the world, and you have different versions of it. You have the secular humanism that is just a completely naturalistic, atheistic worldview. Even Marxism, that's influencing our world now, is a form of naturalism. There is no God. Everything is based upon the matter and the things. Marxism just views it in a particular way and views it as struggles, and use classical Marxism as class struggle. And the new cultural Marxism views it as race, ethnicity struggles. And that's all it is. It's just stuff struggling for control. And so this naturalism, again, nature is all there is. It's the natural step that theologically, when you remove God, this is all you've got left. This is what you're going to have to plant your feet on to make sense of the world.
Okay. That sounds kind of, thinking about the previous episodes and also thinking about what we spoke about on virtue, that when we spoke about Christian theism, me and Hendrik, we spoke about how God is like an ontological foundation to a lot of objective things in the world, like morality or even meaning. So it kind of sounds dire to think the naturalistic framework and how does it go into it. But let's get into what is the naturalistic framework and how we can describe it. What does naturalism say about epistemology? How do we know truth?
Well, the problem is with naturalism and epistemology, you're going back into what is truth itself. And again, depending on how you slice this pie, if our brains are simply the products of the environment, and going back all the way to my early years, this would be circa 2001, 2002 at Middle Tennessee. We had a gentleman who sat at the back of the room. I was taking a class, the culture of the Bible. They offered 2 classes at this secular school on the Bible, and me and some friends, we decided to be brave and take this. And there was a man who sat at the back, and we called him long-haired philosophy man, because we did not know his name, and he had long hair, and he spouted philosophy all day long. So this was one of my first brushes, and he would talk about how when we touch like a table, we're not actually touching the table. Our senses are firing, and that our brains are interpreting these sensations. So when you think you're touching the table, all you're really experiencing is the flares in your brain. The same thing when you see something, you don't actually see that thing. It's your brain's interpretation of all the light particles that have come in. So he would say these things, and we of course we thought of them as nonsense, which is why the church needs to understand philosophy, because he was being very Kantian actually at the time. And but there's also this element in terms of the natural world where what is that truth, and if all you're doing is understanding the signals and the impulses, then there is no real external truth. There's just stuff. So, what do we mean by true? We have an object that's in front of me. And again, I have a table here in front of me. I call it a table, but what is it really? What am I knowing? All I'm knowing is my perspective of the table. I have my language. Does language, we start going into that, does language actually alter and skew all of reality? When you're in a naturalistic world and everything is random chaos in terms of the particles, I think all truth goes that way as well. You don't have that foundation anymore. Even the modernists, what they try to do is following Descartes and crew and the scientists, they said, they wanted to catalog, they wanted to understand. In their view, they said, objectively understand the world. What do I have? I can catalog a frog, and I have this thing called a frog, and I have its nature. Well, all you have is data. And this is why Hume comes along, and David Hume and he hated religion. He was like, there's no, our minds are putting these ideas together, and there's no real necessary connection. Well, that's why Kant comes along, tries to rescue that by making everything a matter of perspective and our worldviews. And we enter into this mess in modern philosophy, which is why I think most Christians hate philosophy. Modern philosophy is a nasty mess. And you get into all this kind of stuff and you get frustrated. And I think what happens with naturalism, what it shows is, what do we mean by truth? Do we mean just our perspective? Everything has to be filtered through this mind, and this is why I think the modern philosophy starts with the mind. They don't start with things. Most people don't even realize that. Like, you really want to divide all the philosophy into two camps. You have the camp that starts with things, that was the classical system, and you have the camp that starts with the mind. So for the naturalists, they're all starting with their mind. They're all starting with their perspective. And so this is where truth then becomes relative. We're seeing the payoff of that today, because in a naturalistic world, there's no such thing as men and women. What is a man? What is a woman? All of these words, all of these things, all of our concept of reality is up for grab. We're seeing the payoff of naturalism run wild. And that's why, in terms of epistemology, it can be in some ways whatever you want it to be, because none of it really matters anyway. But that's nihilism, and that's another talk for another day. But that's why it leads to. That's why Sire points out the naturalism leads to this nihilism, because you've cut yourself from any anchor. You don't have anything other than you have chemical processes, you have natural elements, but from that, how do you get truth, beauty, goodness? There's no such thing. This is why, even in the art world, tape a banana to the wall and that's art. Why? Because there's no real truth. What is art? Art is just a construct. What is gender? It's just a construct. What is reality? It's just a construct at that point. And again, this is why not all naturalists go that far. Some naturalists are still living off of the interest paid by the theistic worldview. They're still grounded many times. And this is why when I'm dealing with somebody who says, that they are an atheist and they're following a form of naturalism, you'll hear them say, that certain things are just evil. Like, you don't get that without God. There is no problem of evil. The biggest problem of evil is that if there is no God, there is no evil. So that means racism, pedophilia, all of these horrible things, they're no longer wrong, because it's just atoms being moved around. And there's still, though, plenty of naturalists who are like, no, I'm a good enough person. I recognize that some things are just wrong. Like, you're inconsistent enough to have that foundation, which I'm glad for. I'm glad for the people who still have a sense of right and wrong. I think we're starting to see in our world what it's going to look like when we completely lose that foundation.
Yeah, that is scary.
But that's the basis. That's where we're heading.
But isn't it? And you kind of say, but it's so kind of self-contradicting in the sense of, during the Enlightenment, with the rise of theism, with going into naturalism, and you just spoke about, just if I think of the four horsemen of atheism that we had, they have this overemphasis on reason and using the mind. But if you go to fundamentally what they believe in terms of how does our thinking work, how does your mind work, then they can't really objectively trust their own reason, because it's just atoms firing off each other. It's just chemistry. I think it's Frank Turek that calls us moist robots. If you go down that route of the atheistic framework, is basically just moist robots. We are kind of programmed at the atomic level just to go in a certain direction, and you actually, on a moral level, you can't be culpable for anything that you're doing. You can't be held accountable, because it's not as if you decided it. You kind of just a reaction, atomic reaction.
Well, and that's reminding me, even I was listening to, there's this a series, the Great Courses series. So you go to the Great Courses and you have everything from learn to play guitar to, in this case, I was listening to a lecture series on Stoicism. And it's one of the major players in the revival of Stoicism, and I was wanting to hear what he said. And he went that route. He was talking about how, because of the fact that we are just those particles, the fact that we are just what we are, there's this sense of determinism, that we are determined to do certain things, and it's because it's just cause and effect, just chain reaction. So you ask, well, why is this guy promoting this philosophy of Stoicism? And the whole reason for him, and the reason he promotes it, is just simply because it just helps him function in the world. Life is not as miserable when you eliminate your desires, which is where Stoicism goes. So it's really almost, if I can use the phrasing, that crutch, that opiate of the masses, that just find whatever helps you function, whatever gives you enough of a delusion that you can find some sort of happiness before you die, because it doesn't matter anyway. And whatever it is you're doing, there is no real you. You don't have a basis for consciousness. And I know there's many naturalists. No, 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 no. There is a basis. Like, there is a real us, and they can start talking about programming and all that, almost like where with our minds being complex computers. But at the fundamental level, it doesn't hold up. You recognize that dead matter, more complex, is still, in a sense, dead matter. It's just functioning differently. The chemical processes might be different. The movement might be different, but you don't have a difference in quality. You just have a difference in quantity. And these problems that come out with philosophy, you end up with, again, the mind-body problem, the idea that, if we're, this is Descartes' problem, if we're physical beings and we have this spiritual mind, how do they interact? The atheist comes along, and the naturalist, they don't believe in the spirit. We just have these chemical processes. We are just the firing of our chemical neurons. And it makes for great sci-fi movies. This is where movies like Total Recall, The Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind. I mean, there's all these movies where you implant ideas and memories. Was Inception? That was the more trippy one, Leonardo DiCaprio. So you look at these kinds of things, and it's interesting, but you realize at a fundamental level we're more than that. And if we're not, then we have bigger problems. And this is why the naturalist can't deal with these issues unless I think this was Frank Turek's book, Stealing from God. This is somewhat of the point he makes in there, that they have to take just enough to prop up their worldview, because if you don't, you're going to slide completely into the bottom, into nihilism, into a very dark place. And I think because from a worldview concept, if you begin with the premise that God does not exist, and you wrap everything else around there, you're going to get naturalism, but you're going to find yourself on that genuine slippery slope that's going to take you into nihilism. You're not going to be able to avoid that. You're going to have to, in a sense, say God does not exist, and there's good and evil in the world. But again, you've got people like Nietzsche. That was Nietzsche's whole point behind his book, Beyond Good and Evil, is that you have to get beyond this idea that there's any kind of good and evil. As soon as you let that go, then everything else is going to make a whole lot more sense. And the thing is, he's not wrong. In a godless world, there is no real good, there is no real evil. And I think that for the people who've camped in naturalism, they're still clinging to those remnants of the theistic worldview that's preventing that slide, preventing that move, and falling off ultimately, because they can't account for their own consciousness. They can't account for anything that doesn't fit in a test tube. And even when they say, as many naturalists will do, that science is what gives us all truth, no scientific experiment was performed to give us that idea that science gives us all truth. It's an unverified assumption. It's about the only one they've got, given the way they've hedged themselves in. But you can't say that you're being scientific when you think that science gives you all truth, because you did not come to it by a scientific experiment.
That reminds me of, I think it was one of William and Craig's early debates with Peter Atkins, and Peter Atkins was making the argument that all truth should be evaluated through the scientific method, or at least that which we believe should go through the scientific method. And Craig listed for him 5 things, including science itself, that can't be verified through the scientific method. So that is self-defeating. That is interesting.
Well,
Okay.
and I just want to
Yeah.
point out, because even in the apologetic world, even at the Bible college, I've had professors challenge me that God's existence cannot be mathematically proven. And I remember having this conversation, and I said, "Well, we're not trying to. God's not math. Like, you mathematically prove mathematics. Why would I want to mathematically prove God? Like, we're not even. That's not even what we're trying to do." So I think I think inside the church and outside the church, there's a lot of confusion, and why, going back to our original conversation, philosophy is so important to sort these ideas out and what these things mean. And I think this is why we as Christians have to sort this out for ourselves first, if we're going to help other people and other worldviews sort these ideas out for themselves.
I totally agree. And that is one of the reasons I want this podcast one of the reasons I started it is because, firstly, we are not only we influenced by ideas, but we kind of propagate new ideas without realizing the consequences that could have. But secondly, is if we want to have an impact on the world and to change the world, we kind of have to sort out our own mess first.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so what does naturalism say about the ultimate reality?
Well, ultimate reality for the naturalist is just going to be, it's going to be the material world. It's just going to be matter. Matter exists. It always has been there. Or if it, and this is where again you get into the problems. If you say that matter came into being, you go to Einsteinian relativity, and you think that the space-time continuum came into being at a certain point in time, you have a problem, because what brought it in? Or you have to maintain that the universe matter has always existed, which creates another problem because of all the laws of physics that would say that we're running out of usable energy and all these other things that have would basically why the universe would be dead if it has always existed. That's what they maintain. The Carl Sagan, was it the cosmos, was and is and all there ever will be. It's just the universe. What you see is what you get. This is all there is. The only thing that you don't see that you get is you start going into the quantum particles. But everything that is must exist at the physical natural level. There is, if it's immaterial, it doesn't really have existence. Like ideas, the whole thing about values, even the whole concept of truth, it just doesn't exist. There's things that exist, but you just essentially live in a universe that's like the machine. Everything happens by chemical processes, by gravity, by the different components. That's all there is, and it's a simple explanation. It's one of the easy ones, and this is why with the naturalists, they say just look around. Like, how do you know that there's a God beyond this? And I think that it's the pantheists provide some fun with it, because they're like, how do you know this is even real? That's a whole nother thing. But again, we're not going to get there. So we're going to stick with the naturalistic, like that particles are real. That's all there is. But that's it. I mean, it's a simple explanation. The material is real. Anything else outside the material does not exist.
How do they deal then with you mentioned Einstein's relativity, but like the Big Bang theory of oh, no, I forgot that physicist's name. Wow. One of the most popular physicists with ALS, Stephen Hawking.
There you go.
How do they deal with like Hawking's Big Bang theory that to show that scientifically, to show that there had to be a point of singularity, a place where space time and matter had a beginning. And also, you think of, and I think William and Craig does a lot of work on this, but the philosophically that there can't be an infinite regress in terms of an actual infinite. So how do they deal with that then?
So Before I answer that, I think this is another reason philosophy is so important. A lot of believers, when I start talking about this kind of stuff, I watch their eyes glaze over and, and they're like, we're not astrophysicists. I'm like, I'm not asking you to be. Just asking you, and like, I'm not a musician, but it's good to understand what the scales are and the basic concept of music theory. But like, this is part of what it means to be human. So I think from the church side, we need to understand this because it's easy enough. The components are within our grasp. And when we do that, that's why when we hear some of the things that the naturalists will say, we will hear the contradictions. Um, and I know this comes from the popular TV show. There was a TV show on called Bones.
Mm.
The forensic anthropologist Temperance Brenning was her name, based on a real life person. But in the TV show, this question would come up all the time because Booth, her eventual love interest, was Catholic. She was an atheist, and she would say, that it was gravity and the dust particles. Like, so they'll start with something usually. And there was a professor in Arizona, I think it was, and he was on Stephen Colbert, I believe, and he was talking about like the various different kinds of things, of different kinds of nothing, like multiple kinds of nothing. And Colbert makes the joke. He's like, okay, I'm not a smart man, but you're going to have to explain to me how there can be different kinds of nothing. So you end up with some of these ideas, some of these theories that are ad hoc. They'll do theories like this, or they'll just ignore the science. This was one of the guys on our team, Norm Ledford. He talks about, he's got a friend who's a PhD, like physicist. I mean, he's got some friends with credentials, and Norm does not have those credentials, but he will engage these very basic ideas, and he knows enough of the science to know they're violating it. They have to, almost like what Einstein did when he was working out his equations and ends up dividing by zero, just so his equations would not point to that singular beginning that he knew posed a problem in his worldview, in being that he was like a materialistic pantheist. He believes the universe is just all one piece of matter kind of thing. There's no spirit, but in a closed system like that, if it all came into being, it can't give birth to itself. That violates the very concept of reality. And so the answer is that for many of them, they don't, or I think what Dawkins did, I think he even wrote like a little kid's book about the magic of universe and how gravity was that magic that brought again all the dust particles together, and that's how you end up with entire solar systems. And again, you're like, but that's not how it works. That's not what the science shows us. That's not feasible in this kind of universe. The naturalists sometimes, well, that's not feasible according to our current understandings. And I'm like, in other words, the science. Like, I'm always quite a great. So in other words, you're saying the science shows you're wrong, but you're going to ignore it because you want a different conclusion. And I'm the closed-minded one. Like, like it's they're committing the very things they accuse us of committing. But I would say that if you follow the science, you end up with the source of true science, the scientia, the wisdom, the knowledge. That's what the Latin means. You follow that, you're going to find the source, and I would maintain that's in God.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. And then the last question in terms of naturalism, what does it say about humanity?
It's really a sad state in naturalism. Again, you'll have naturalists, and I can name them. I can name faces, name people who have a very high view of the human being. It's just not warranted. It doesn't make sense. That a human is just the product of the environment. I will say this: in your country, I got to go to the cradle of humankind. So I was just there a few weeks ago. And what stood out so much to me through all of these presentations, basically showing, hey, here's the kinds of links and here's the development of the different proto-humanoids and all the different skeletons they reconstructed from pieces of jawbones, kind of thing. I look at this, and I was a little bit louder and more vocal than I should have been, probably. But I said, if all of this is true, I said, if we are just animals, then I said, look at what animals do. They destroy the weaker creatures. They destroy the weaker members of their own race. And I said, why aren't we doing that? If we are really animals, why not take Nietzsche to task? Why not just exert our own will through our power? What makes any of that wrong? And I think what struck me so much was just, again, being in South Africa, where South Africa, I've learned a great deal about the nation's struggles with racism and the different battles between ethnic groups. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, a very racially charged city in the United States. So I understand a little bit of what that's like from the inside. To understand that we are all human, and that means something more than animal. But in that cradle of humankind, we're just animals. We are higher functioning animals. And inside of naturalism, you have to come to terms with that. And the evils, I would say, if I'm going to use a loaded term, the evils that follow from that are the greatest atrocities we've seen in the 20th century. But you can't say they're wrong. You may not like them. Maybe practically they weren't best, but you can't say they're wrong, because naturalism has eliminated any sense of genuine humanity. And this is why even you have the Nuremberg trials, the whole idea of crimes against humanity, first time that phrase was used. How do we judge the Nazis for what they did? It's crimes against humanity. But in the naturalistic world, no such humanity exists. And that's another reason why I'm glad, at least in the middle of the 1900s, we still had that theistic worldview, enough of a hold that we recognize that. There is no innate value. You only have practical value. There's no sense in which a human has any inherent worth. This is why Marxism, you are what you produce. It's all about this communal good now instead of any actual good. So the various potholes in humanity with naturalism, I think we're going to start seeing in as further we get in the 21st century, we're going to see these things play out a lot more, because once we get into a world where naturalism has its strongest hold on the masses now, which I think is going to be the first time that's really happened in terms of Western history. There's always been a sense of theistic or some sort of spiritual like worldview that's held this together. Just like I think it was, even Dawkins has a much higher view of Christianity now. He's like, kind of holding everything together. And Nietzsche said the same thing. God is dead. Like, what are we going to do now? Like this is going to be bad.
Didn't Dawkins call himself a cultural Christian just like a few weeks ago?
Oh, yes. He likes the traditions and all this, but we have this rise of, and this has been going on for several years now in my country, in America, pastors and priests who are atheists. They don't believe that there's a real God. They just like the traditions. And what that is, it's just intellectually dishonest. They're playing both sides of the team. They might enjoy it. They might have a good go of it, because particularly the advantage then, you get all the security of spirituality, but none of the responsibility. And I think naturalism is that natural, lack of a better term. it is the result of disconnecting from the creator. But I think what we've seen, we look at the epistemology, we've looked at the metaphysics, what is ultimate reality, those kinds of things. Again, for the Christian, they're heady. Oh yeah. But you get down to the anthropology, what is a human being? And all of a sudden we're in a really bad place. And it doesn't make naturalism false just because the results are so bad. I think many Christian philosophers will point that out. But I don't think many naturalists themselves understand that it goes against their view of the world, that there is truth, there is goodness, and there's beauty, and naturalism kills every bit of that. And if you do believe there is such things, naturalism is not the vehicle that's going to get you there. It's going to slide you into the pit of nihilism, and there is no real escape. There's plenty of ways to distract yourself. There's plenty of ways to get along in the world until you finally die, and that's it. But you end up essentially just playing games until you die, which is absolutely depressing in terms of a worldview.
Yeah, that is depressing. And for those of you who want to know more about the despair and dire straits of nihilism, tune into the next episode of Dr. McCuddy and I'm going to have on nihilism and what nihilism is. But I want to get back to that view on humanity. So what I've seen is the slippery slope that naturalism creates, especially of humanity, and sometimes it kind of created this atmosphere for the climate change cult. I want to say the people or the nature cult kind of thing, where we have this group of especially young people, but this atheistic group who are naturalistic in a sense, but they are overemphasizing nature uh, towards humanity, and humanity is like this biggest threat to nature, if that makes sense. So it's not only that humans are animals, but it's as if some of them take it to a point where humans are less valuable than animals, and that we are um, actually just a threat to the world and everything around us. There's a movie now on Netflix. I don't know if you've watched it, Under Paris. It's a
Mm.
shark attack movie. One of mine, Lazan's favorite pastimes is watching shark attack movies, because before I got into theology, I wanted to study marine biology, and I'm actually fascinated with sharks. But and I like watching shark attack movies to point out the what is false in it. But in this movie, you have this woke 20-something girl who believes that killing an animal is murder, is the same as killing a person. And the shark is starting to evolve because of climate change, and is now up in the Seine River of Paris, and is killing people. And the police divers want to um, try to get it out, but she's afraid that they are going to kill it. So the shark had a beacon on it because of previous research. She hacks the process, turns off the beacon so that the divers don't know in that murky water where the shark is, because she's afraid they're going to kill the shark's life, but there is no account to what about those people in the water type of thing. It's an interesting movie. She, to spoiler alert, she kind of suffers on her own altar of nature worship in a sense at the end, but yeah, it's interesting. So that's interesting for me as to how we have that now.
Well, and on that note, when you start thinking killing animals is like murder, like killing humans. Okay, in a naturalistic world, yeah, I mean, you have humans and you have dumb animals. There's a sense that, and I think Peter Singer goes this route. He's like, we have a responsibility to protect the dumb animals because they can't protect themselves. But the problem I have is okay, yeah, it's just like killing people, but neither of which actually matters. That again, we know this in the animal kingdom. Killing other creatures is what you do. Like that's good. That's normal, whether it's food or sport or whatever. It doesn't matter. So I think the problem actually goes in reverse. That number one, like let's take the extinction of sharks. Now I like Shark Week, so I was always in Discovery Channel watching. I'm terrified of the water. I cannot swim in open water because God made fish with teeth. Um, but I love watching. But in a naturalistic world, all the sharks go extinct. Who cares? Why is there any value behind that? What difference has it ever made at the cradle of the humankind? They had this big rendition of the dodo bird, and this whole thing, you like press the button, you get to hear this whole thing about how humans came in and killed all the dodos, and I'm like, and what does the extinction of the dodo have to do with my life? So this is where naturalism gets you. Like, none of that matters, and you kill someone. Why does that matter? Why does that ultimately matter? And you've got plenty of movies that are tackling that issue, that you have almost this idea that, if you can get away with it, like, like who cares? Like, there's no real value behind human life because, again, in a naturalistic world, there is none. And even this is why the climate change activists, they I want to be cautioned. Don't be careful with the equivocating on the concept of nature, because the naturalist, believing that nature is all that there is, the nature conservationists, they're sort of elevating nature, and they're like, we should protect our environment. But again, I would say, who cares? Why? So that my future generation can have, but that doesn't change anything for me. And I love in the movie, the original Matrix, which came out much longer ago than I wish to remember. In the original Matrix, Agent Smith, when he's interrogating Morpheus, compares the human race to a virus. And I would have to say, in a naturalistic world, if the humans are a virus to the world, then we do what viruses do. We destroy, kill everything, and move on. Who cares? We all die anyway in the end. We die faster, we die slower. What does it matter? That's what you can't answer in a truly naturalistic world. What you can do is you can call me names. You can say, like, well, that's inhumane. I was like, what does that mean? Like, what if it is truly human nature to kill and steal and pillage? We don't have a basis. You only get morality when there is a standard. And this is why so many people, even C.S. Lewis was this way when he recognized, like, he said, there's so much evil in the world, but where did he get this concept from? How does he know what a crooked line is unless he has an idea of a straight one? Who makes the straight one? Where do you get that straight line? And he understood that was God. And that's what brought him back to faith. But I think in our world, we say these things like we should protect our environment, and you can say that all you want to. Why should we? Ultimately, in a naturalistic world, in a universe that is going to die anyway. And I'll quote one more since we're talking movies. I used to work at a Hollywood video, so I can quote some movies now. There was a recent. It's not the live action Godzillas. There was one that was more of like this strange computer anime style. It was a series of movies, a couple of them. And in it, they come across this alien race, and they're trying to get back to Earth and basically kill Godzilla is the whole idea. But the problem with this alien race, they're sort of a death cult. And what they've recognized in this show, they said they've done the calculations. Everything in the universe eventually dies. So the whole point of this cult is, why wait and fizzle out? Why not burn out in a blaze of glory? And that's what they're trying to do, is destroy all life. And you look at them and you're like, you're obviously supposed to see them as the bad guy. But in a naturalistic world, how is that the bad guy? In a naturalistic world, why is Thanos the bad guy? He kills half the universe's population, which makes it paradise for the other half. That's the goal. What you are disconnected. You watch the Marvel movies, you watch the superhero movies. This is why anti-heroes are becoming so much more popular, I believe, is because the original Superman, who fought for truth, justice, and, as the world gets angry, the American way, as Superman would say, he had a strong sense of morality. And now you see more of Superman the psychopath, because you don't have that sense of goodness anymore. And so this is why, again, all these questions that we ask, all of these things which relate to philosophically with naturalism, it's so much more than just, I like to get all my data from science. I like to be scientific. I think that's what everybody equates. I follow naturalism and I am scientific. That is such a small portion of the overall larger view that I don't think even many naturalists have seriously thought through. And this is partly, in some ways, what we need to do as Christians, is we need to say, actually, I have a better argument for you, but you're really not going to like where it goes. Now let's really get into the conversation.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I just got to look at the time. It's been really great having you on. I think we can go on for hours. I'm really enjoying this conversation a lot, but I think this would be a good place to end it. And then just before we end it, where can people find more about you and about your ministry?
Best places, we're currently redoing our website, but familiesofvirtue.com is the main one. And a lot of the courses, a lot of the training, we do a lot of mentoring is the way we look at it. We're not offering classes like a Bible college. We want to mentor, we want to grow people. Classicalvirtueacademy.com is where you can see what we're offering. We're starting this August a new round of courses, everything from we want to learn about the nature and attributes of God. I just connected with somebody else. He wants to learn philosophy, Old Testament survey. We're even doing New Testament Greek. We want to help people grow in intellectual and moral virtue. Those are going to be the two places that you'll find us out on the web.
And I think that is a positive note to end on after all the despair of naturalism. Definitely getting back to virtue. Okay, I'll definitely link that in the description. Dr. McCuddy, thank you very much for this episode. It was really an honor, and I'm looking forward to speaking to you on nihilism in a couple of weeks. Goodbye,
Thank you,
everyone,
sir.
and I hope it's a pleasure. Goodbye, everyone, and I hope you have a great time. Until next time, goodbye.